Luna stood at the edge of the gallery, her glass of wine held delicately between her fingers. She had long, dark hair that fell in loose, bohemian waves, a few small crystals woven through the strands catching the light. Her style was a mix of 90s grunge and retro charm, and tonight she wore a vintage floral slip dress, the hem skimming her curves, paired with a well-worn leather jacket slung over her shoulders. Chunky boots completed the look, adding a bit of toughness to the otherwise delicate ensemble. She looked like she had stepped out of another era, but her confidence and quiet intensity were purely of this moment. She had spent weeks preparing for this exhibition, pouring her soul into every piece, and now she was here, standing among the crowds that had come to see her work, yet she felt detached, like an observer in her own life. She scanned the room, her eyes briefly locking on each person who lingered by her paintings, searching for something. Approval, maybe, or understanding. But no one quite caught her attention until she saw him. He was standing alone, leaning casually against the wall, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He wore a dark fitted t-shirt that hugged his frame just right, and his hair was slightly tousled as if he hadn't bothered to do much with it. There was a quiet, unassuming confidence about him, a laid-back demeanor that seemed to set him apart from the polished, pretentious crowd. He had that alternative casual look, like someone who didn't need to try hard to make an impression. Yet, here he was, managing to do just that. He was in his mid-30s, but there was a youthful sharpness to his features that made it hard to pin down his exact age. Luna caught herself staring. She didn't usually make a habit of approaching strangers, but there was something about the way he was looking at her painting, like he was seeing beyond the colors, the brush strokes, like he was peeling back the layers to find the truth hidden underneath. She took a deep breath and walked over. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. He turned to face her, and Luna felt the air shift between them. His eyes were dark, intense, with a kind of sharpness that made her feel like he could see right through her. "I think," he said, his lips curving into a small, teasing smile, "you've captured something raw, something vulnerable, but maybe that's just me." Luna wasn't used to this. Most people who approached her work gave generic compliments, but he spoke with a certainty that made her want to listen. "Art isn't about what I intend," she replied, tilting her head slightly. "It's about what you see." He raised an eyebrow, as if amused by her answer. "And what if I see something you didn't mean to reveal?" She felt a flicker of something, curiosity maybe, or anticipation. "Then I'd say you're looking deeper than most." He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking, and Luna could catch the faint, earthy scent of his cologne. "Aiden," he said, offering his hand. "And you're the artist everyone's here to see, I assume." "Luna," she replied, slipping her hand into his. His grip was firm, his skin warm, and she found herself holding on a little longer than necessary before letting go. "And yes, I suppose that's me." "Well, Luna," he said, his tone playful, yet laced with a quiet confidence. "I'd like to know more about your work. Maybe we could talk about it over a drink?" Luna hesitated, glancing around the crowded room. She wasn't used to this kind of directness, but something about Aiden's presence made her want to stay. "All right," she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I could use a break from this." They ended up on the gallery's balcony overlooking the city's twinkling skyline. The night air was cool, a gentle breeze playing with the ends of Luna's hair. She leaned against the railing, feeling the weight of the night lift slightly. Aidan handed her another glass of wine, and for a moment they stood in comfortable silence, the sounds of the party muted behind them. "So," Aidan said, breaking the silence, "tell me something about your work that you don't tell everyone." Luna took a sip of her wine, letting the question settle. "I guess I paint what I can't say out loud. It's easier that way." Aiden's eyes were on her, unwavering. "And what would you say, if you could?" She felt a blush creep up her cheeks, and she looked away, laughing softly. "I don't know. I think I'm still figuring that out." He stepped closer, his shoulder brushing against hers, and when she glanced up, he was already looking at her. His expression softened but still intense. "Then maybe we could figure it out together." Luna didn't know what to make of this man, this unexpected connection, but there was something magnetic about him, something that made her want to lean in and see where this could lead. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aidan looked down at her. "Who said I was being nice?" The words sent a jolt of excitement through her, a thrill she hadn't felt in a long time. And as he reached out, gently tracing his fingers along the curve of her wrist, she knew she was already beginning to fall into whatever this was, into him. The air on the balcony seemed thicker, charged with a tension that Luna wasn't sure she understood, but she didn't want to break it. Aiden's fingers still lingered near her wrist, a subtle touch that felt far more intimate than it should have. She could feel his eyes on her, and when she looked up, he was studying her with that same intense, unreadable gaze. "So," he said, his voice smooth, almost coaxing, "you like to hide behind your paintings, let them say everything you're too afraid to." Luna blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of his words. I wouldn't say that," she replied, even though she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. "I just—" "You just what?" he interrupted, stepping closer, so close she could feel the warmth of his body, even through the cool night air. "Pretend that you're fine with the way things are? That you're happy letting people see only the surface?" Luna felt her cheeks flush, a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "You don't know anything about me," she said, trying to sound firm, but it came out more like a challenge. Aiden's smile was slow, almost predatory. "Maybe not, but I know you're not used to someone seeing you, really seeing you. It makes you uncomfortable, doesn't it?" She opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat as he raised his hand, his fingers grazing her jaw before sliding down to her neck. For a moment, he just held it there, his palm warm against her skin, his thumb resting just below her chin. It wasn't tight, not really, but the suggestion of pressure was enough to make her pulse race. "Do you want me to stop?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. It wasn't a question, it was a dare. Luna's breath hitched. She could have stepped back, could have pulled away, but she didn't. Instead, she found herself leaning into his touch, her heart hammering in her chest. "No," she said, barely able to hear her own voice over the rush of blood in her ears. "Good," he murmured, and his hand tightened just a little, enough to make her gasp, "because I don't like to be told no." For a moment the world seemed to shrink down to just them, to the way his hand felt on her throat, the way his eyes bored into hers. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but there was a thrill in it, a dark, heady sensation that made her want to see how far he would push. "You like it, don't you?" he said, tilting his head slightly, studying her reaction, "being put in your place." Luna's cheeks burned, but she didn't look away. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Aiden said, and this time there was no teasing in his tone, only a quiet, almost cruel certainty. "I can see it. You want someone to see through all that pretty little mess you've wrapped yourself in and tell you exactly where you stand." She felt her throat constrict under his hand, and she realized with a shiver that she did want it, that he had seen something in her she hadn't even admitted to herself. "Maybe," she whispered. Aiden's smile was a slow, lazy curl of his lips. "Maybe isn't good enough, Luna." He released her suddenly, his hand dropping away, as if she had ceased to hold his interest. The absence of his touch left her feeling cold, like she had been thrown back into reality after a moment of pure, unfiltered connection. "You'll figure that out." She stood there stunned as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, casually tapping at the screen. "Give me your number." It wasn't a request, and she found herself nodding, her hands moving almost automatically as she took his phone and typed in her number. When she handed it back, he glanced at the screen, then slid the phone back into his pocket with a satisfied nod. "I'll call you," he said, and for a moment it felt like a promise. But then he turned away, heading back inside without a backward glance. "Be ready." Luna watched him go, her heart still racing, her skin still tingling where he had touched her. She had come out here to escape, to find a moment of peace, and instead she felt like she had been thrown off of a cliff, plummeting into something she didn't quite understand, but desperately wanted to explore. As the door swung shut behind him, Luna let out a shaky breath, her fingers brushing her throat where his hand had been, feeling the echo of his grip. She didn't know what she was getting herself into, but as she stood there alone on the balcony, she realized she was already hooked.